안녕하세요. 저는 한국인 최초로 세계 디베이트 챔피언, 하버드 토론팀 코치, 그리고 디베이터 작가인 서보현입니다. These days, debate seems like a blood sport.
여기서 두 분이 완전히 극명하게 의견이 갈리시기 때문에
끝장 토론 seems to be the order of the day. Its categorization of people into left versus right, young versus old, man versus woman, reduces our humanity to labels and pits us against one another. In such an atmosphere, it's tempting to want to switch off, to fall silent, or to focus on those things that unite us. However, nor does debate just occur at the level of politics or the media. It's a very real part of our daily lives. When I was 8 years old, I moved from South Korea to Australia without speaking English. And I'm an only child, and so it was just me and my parents. And I remember seeing them work so hard, traveling across a city that they were not familiar with, picking out furniture, looking for the school where to send me. And I remember asking them from the backseat of the car as they were traveling the city trying to do these things, what can I do to help? And they said to me there was only one thing, which is to find your place at school. The problem with that, and the hardest part of crossing language lines for me, was adjusting to real-life conversation. And the hardest conversations to adjust to were disagreements. And in those moments where you have to be vulnerable, to put forward your position that's at odds with what other people might believe. And I remember on the playground practicing exactly what I might want to say to the kids that I was disagreeing with. And once I managed to get the words out, seeing them say, does anybody know what this guy is talking about? And falling back into the silence from which I had started. And those kinds of experiences made me resolve just to smile, to nod, and to keep most of my thoughts to myself. I thought the work of disagreement simply wasn't worth it. And so even though my language started to come along after a couple of years, in a school of 2 or 3 other Koreans and a handful more of Asians, that drawing attention to my differences, that raising my voice in disagreement or dissent would unsettle any foothold of belonging I had been able to achieve. Now, what changed for me was a promise that my 5th grade teacher made me. She told me that, on the debate team, when one person speaks, no one else does. And to someone who had become used to being spoken over and interrupted and spun out of conversation, that sounded like a kind of salvation. And so I joined. And I remember standing on that stage as a 5th grader on a spring day, looking out into a crowd of 50 or so kids seated in snaking lines. And I remember thinking I had never been here before. I had never seen attention pulled around me in this way. I had never experienced a kind of silence that was waiting for my voice. And I thought something could change. And I remember that thinking that perhaps through the power of speech and language, I could not only survive the world, but could start to change it too. This, I think, is the biggest misunderstanding about debate. People assume it's only for the loudest, most confident, and naturally brilliant kids, but in my experience, those kids don't need debate. They can excel elsewhere. The difficulty compounds when one remembers that some of the hardest disagreements in the world are those we have with loved ones. When we decide to commit ourselves to a family or to a partner, we do something wonderful. We begin to build a shared life. But this overlap also presents near infinite opportunities for conflict. So an argument about the dirty dishes becomes about how you looked at me last week and what your mother-in-law says, until the discussion becomes unwieldy and impossible. When I was in middle school, my dad and I would get into a recurring disagreement about calling our relatives in Korea. I hated phone calls then, and I supposed myself busy with other things, and so dodged these calls every chance I got. One night, after I ignored my dad's request to come downstairs to talk on the phone, I heard him storm upstairs. He came into my room and began to yell. We began to argue about how many times I had spoken to my relatives in the past year with untold intensity. But before the discussion could snowball and take on its momentum, Dad and I thought to ask each other a question. What are we really disagreeing about? And what came out was not the number of phone calls, but what it said about the loss of my connection to Korea. Once we had named our disagreement, we stopped talking past one another and began genuinely to engage. Debaters learned there are 3 types of disagreements. Factual, dealing with the way things are. For example, Paris is the capital of France. Normative, dealing with the way things ought to be. For example, that lying should always be considered immoral. And prescriptive, dealing with what we should do. For example, whether we should take vacation this year. Naming our disagreement prevents them from generating into mere conflict. Here's a second lesson. Choose your battles. In Debater, I argue that cleverness is the ability to make any argument, but that wisdom is knowing which to respond to and which to let go. To help with that, I offer in the book a checklist to consult before jumping into any given argument. The RISA checklist. It invites you to ask 4 questions before starting a disagreement, recognizing that disagreements are easy to get into and hard to stop. First, is the disagreement between you and the other side real? Or is it just an imagined slight or misunderstanding? Second, is it important enough to justify having the disagreement? Third, is it specific enough so that you're going to be able to make progress within the time you have? And fourth, are the 2 sides aligned in their reasons for wanting to engage in the dispute? Now, none of that guarantees a good outcome. In fact, though people think debate is about winning or losing, the truth is that you're going to lose a lot. The World Championships has 500 teams and 1 winner. So almost all of us are in the 499 almost all of the time. That experience teaches us that being correct is not the same as being persuasive. I've struggled a lot with the basic question. What is a good argument? I wanted to make bold promises that good arguments are ones that expand your horizons, enrich your relationships, and help you advance in work and life. And I believe debate can do all that. But I think the better answer is that a good argument is one in which both sides walk away feeling like they would do that again. So I used to think of disagreement as a barrier to relationships, something that could break them down, something that could sour them. The problem with conflict avoidance is that it's a decision to not engage with all aspects of the person sitting across the room from us. It's to say, I'll engage with you only in as much as you agree with me. I mentioned at the beginning a buzzword that has come to characterize our understanding of debate. 끝장 토론. The problem with the concept is that our opponents don't simply disappear because we beat them in an argument. They'll be back the next day, or the next week, or the next month to discuss another topic. For better or for worse, we live together. And so to limit ourselves and to limit our relationships, I think, is a path towards loneliness and a path towards shallower relationships. What happens when, as a result of painful conversations, we decide to avoid conflicts is we opt to stop speaking altogether, so that though we live together, though we live side by side, we miss the connections that should develop as a result. But nowadays, I think a relationship without some healthy disagreement can only be shallow, can only be incomplete, can only speak to parts of ourselves rather than recognizing the whole. And so I hope the tools of good disagreement and of good conversation can help us make deeper connections in the relationships that matter most.